Okay, so you want to own Cargill, you picture something simple, a farm to table empire. Maybe you're picturing yourself as the guy who controls the world's food supply, sipping coffee in a glass office while grain silos hum quietly in the background, printing money because, hey, everybody's got to eat. Here's the pivot. You can't buy Cargill, not a single share, not one. It's the largest company in America that has never, in over 150 years, sold stock to the public. And the story of why is stranger and darker than almost anyone realizes. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how a company you've never heard of touches almost everything you ate today, why staying private made one family absurdly rich while identical competitors went bankrupt, and why owning Cargill isn't really a business, it's a bet on human hunger itself. Let's start with what Cargill actually is, because agriculture company undersells it badly. Cargill doesn't grow food. It barely even sells food to you directly. Cargill is the plumbing between the farm and your fridge. The grain elevators, the shipping routes, the meat packing plants, the trading desks that decide what a bushel of corn is worth at 3 a.m. in Chicago. Think of it less like a farmer and more like a toll booth operator standing on every road food has to travel down. You don't have to like the toll booth. You just have to pass it. Founded in 1865 by William Wallace Cargill with a single grain storage warehouse in Iowa, the company is now owned almost entirely by his descendants, the Cargill and McMillan families. Roughly 90% of it still in family hands. And here's the number that should stop you. That one family bloodline has produced more billionaires than any other family on Earth. Read that again. Not a dozen companies. A dozen billionaires from one family off a business most Americans couldn't name. So what does it cost to actually get into this game? Let's talk scale, because the gap here is genuinely insane. Tier 1, the small operator, a single local grain elevator, the kind of business that buys corn off farmers and stores it until prices rise. Startup cost? Somewhere in the low millions depending on storage capacity. You're a rounding error. Cargill doesn't know you exist. Tier 2, the mid-size player. A regional agribusiness or grain cooperative with multiple facilities, rail access, and export contracts. Now you're talking tens to hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure. Companies like this exist across the American Midwest. They survive. They rarely thrive. Tier 3, the massive tier, building something that actually competes with Cargill globally. This is where it gets almost comedic. Cargill's annual revenue sits in the neighborhood of $160 billion, employing roughly 160,000 people across 70 countries. To build a rival from scratch, you're not talking about capital. You're talking about decades of relationships, port access, and trading infrastructure that literally cannot be bought at any price. The only real competitors, ADM, Bunge, Louis Dreyfus, took a century to get there too. This tier isn't a price tag. It's a moat with no bridge. Now here's where the fantasy starts cracking. The hidden costs nobody warns you about once you're actually inside this business. First, you don't control the weather, but you eat every consequence of it. One drought in Brazil, one flood in Iowa, and your entire input cost structure shifts overnight, with zero warning and zero mercy. Second, disease risk in the meat business is catastrophic and constant. Cargill runs some of the largest beef processing plants in North America. A single outbreak, avian flu, mad cow, swine fever, can shut down a billion-dollar facility for weeks. In 2020, COVID outbreaks tore through Cargill's meatpacking plants in Alberta and Pennsylvania, forcing temporary shutdowns and infecting hundreds of workers. That's not a rounding error cost. That's an entire supply chain gasping at once. Third, geopolitics is now a line item. Export bans, tariffs, war. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, global wheat and sunflower oil markets convulsed overnight, and companies like Cargill had to reroute entire shipping lanes mid-contract. You don't get a say. You just get the bill or the windfall, and you never know which one's coming. Fourth, and this is the one that breaks people's brains, thin margins at massive volume. Cargill can move close to $1 trillion worth of commodities and still only pocket a profit margin of around 1 to 2%. Let that land for a moment. This isn't a high-margin luxury business, it's a low-margin volume machine where a tiny miscalculation, multiplied across billions of bushels, can erase a year of profit in a single bad trade. So how does anyone make money here at all? This is where the revenue layers get genuinely fascinating, because most of them are invisible to the public. Layer 1, the obvious one, trading. Cargill buys grain low from farmers, stores it, and sells it high later, or ships it somewhere it's scarce. Classic arbitrage, just at planetary scale. Layer 2, the one nobody thinks about, processing. Raw soybeans are worth almost nothing. Crush them into soybean oil and animal feed, and suddenly you've captured margin at every single step of transformation. Cargill doesn't just move the commodity, it changes its shape and charges for each change. Layer 3. Here's the part that genuinely breaks people's brains. Cargill doesn't actually need commodity prices to go up to make money. It profits off volatility itself through hedging and derivatives trading. When corn prices swing wildly in either direction, Cargill's trading arm can profit from the spread, regardless of whether prices ultimately rise or fall. Read that again. The chaos isn't the risk. For Cargill's trading desk, the chaos is often the product. Layer 4, and this is the counterintuitive one that almost nobody sees coming. Ingredients you've never heard of. Cargill co-owns Truvia, the stevia sweetener brand, through a joint venture with Coca-Cola. It's one of the largest salt producers on Earth, operating a salt mine so deep under Lake Erie that its tunnels stretch for miles beneath the lake bed. And it owns Purina Animal Nutrition. Not the pet food brand you're thinking of, the livestock feed one. Chances are something you ate today, a soda, a snack, a burger, had a Cargill fingerprint somewhere in its ingredient list, and you had absolutely no idea. But here's the trap almost nobody sees coming, and it's the same trap that ends businesses like this one. Fixed costs that don't care how your revenue is doing. Grain elevators, meat packing plants, shipping fleets, port terminals. These don't shrink when a bad harvest hits. The mortgage on a billion-dollar processing plant is due whether soybean prices are up or down 40%. Labor costs for 160,000 employees don't pause because commodity prices crashed last Tuesday. This is a business with massive fixed infrastructure sitting on top of razor-thin, wildly unpredictable margins. It's a knife balanced on a coin. And that exact structural flaw has killed companies that looked, on paper, almost identical to Cargill. Meet Andre and Sie, once one of the 5 dominant grain trading houses on Earth, alongside Cargill itself. Swiss-based, family-controlled, decades of dominance, operating across the same global grain routes Cargill still uses today. Same business model, same industry, same thin-margin, high-volume game. In the late 1990s, Andre made a series of aggressive bets on grain and commodity trades that went badly wrong. The debts piled up. The margins, already razor-thin, couldn't absorb the losses. By 2001, after more than a century in business, Andre and Sie collapsed into bankruptcy. One of the ABCD grain giants? Gone. Just like that. Here's the brutal irony. Cargill didn't dodge this trap by being smarter. It dodged it by being private, patient, and unbothered by shareholders. When margins get crushed, public companies face panicked investors demanding answers by next quarter. Cargill's family owners can absorb a brutal year or even a brutal decade because nobody's forcing a fire sale to satisfy a stock price. That's the entire secret. Staying private isn't a quirky choice. It's survival armor. So let's put real numbers on a good year versus a bad year, because the swing is violent. In a good year, strong harvests, high demand from China, stable geopolitics, Cargill can post profits north of $5 billion. Trading desks are humming, processing margins are fat, and every division from meat to sweeteners is pulling its weight. In a bad year, say, a major drought hitting the US, Corn Belt combined with a trade war restricting exports, that same company can see profits crushed by half or more within 12 months, even while revenue stays roughly flat. Same infrastructure, same 160,000 employees, same fixed costs. Just a brutal collapse in the tiny margin sitting on top of all of it. So, does owning something like Cargill actually make sense? Here's the honest verdict. It depends entirely on your time horizon and your tolerance for invisible risk. If you need quarterly returns, this business will humiliate you. If you can survive a decade of volatility, absorb wars, droughts, and pandemics, and you're patient enough to profit off chaos rather than fear it, the rewards are almost unmatched in scale, as a dozen quiet billionaires from one Minnesota family can confirm. Because in the end, Cargill was never really in the food business. It's in the business of standing at the only toll booth on the road between hunger and dinner, and collecting no matter which direction the traffic is moving.